Mr. President, I have a couple of subjects to talk about, and the first one is all of us in the Senate have just attended a most moving state funeral in the National Cathedral for the late President George H.W. Bush. And there have been many accolades, and so much of it was said so beautifully, so eloquently, and so movingly today by the speakers at the service. I just want the Senate record to reflect one little vignette that I think underscores the kind of compassion and goodness of the man, George H.W. Bush. Many years ago, when this senator was a young congressman and had the privilege of serving with former Senator and then Congressman Claude Pepper, a fellow that had risen to the heights of political power in the 1930s during the Depression, became a champion of the little people. And then as he transitioned to the House of Representatives, became known as Mr. Senior Citizen and the protector of Medicare and Social Security. Many times in the Reagan administration, he was the constant irritant to the presidential administration. And yet, those two Irishmen, when they knew they had their differences, but they knew when to set aside those differences for the sake of the country. That too was carried over by the then vice president who became president, President Bush. An example of George Bush's humanity was in the late 1980s, the Florida delegation got an emergency call to go to Walter Reed Army Hospital because it was in the final hours of Senator, then Congressman Claude Pepper. By the time we got to the hospital, they were proceeding to get Claude into a wheelchair. He had come out of a deep sleep, very possibly a coma, and he was being wheeled out into the waiting room. And who should appear but President George H.W. Bush and Mrs. Bush, because the word had gotten to them that Claude Pepper was about to pass on from this life into the heavenly life. The president decided to make that a real occasion. And so as he joined everybody gathered about Senator Pepper, as Claude was actually master of ceremonies, of greeting everybody and introducing this one to the other one, and Mr. President, this is so-and-so. It was an extraordinary scene. And then President Bush, because he knew a fellow that was his political opponent, but who had been such a substantial part of American political history, said, Claude, I have something that I want to produce and I want to present to you on behalf of a grateful nation, on behalf of your public service. And President Bush bent down and put around Senator Pepper's neck the Medal of Freedom. Naturally, there wasn't a dry eye among those of us that were there. And it's another little vignette in the life of George H.W. Bush that shows the humanity, the care, and the concern for his fellow mankind that was exhibited that day in Walter Reed Army Hospital. So, Mr. President, I wanted to make that little vignette, which is appropriate today after such a moving service over at the National Cathedral.